Hi, and welcome to this live reading from A Long Kiss Goodbye. Onyx and Mercury, Book 2 by H.D. Thomson, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Faith is but a breath away from fear. Just breathe and believe. The Book of Stolen Secrets. Friday, August 16th, 6:15 p.m. Avery Fleming hurried from her car as heat waves rolled up from the ground, pressed around her and into her lungs, nearly suffocating her with its intensity. Perspiration trickled between her breasts. Almost 7 o'clock, and she was sweating worse than a horse after a brutal ride. What fun. The rustle of leaves rattled from nearby trees as a gust of wind thrust her hair into her eyes. She shoved the strands aside and turned her face against the sun's glare. The wind didn't ease the relentless hot air, but exaggerated it that much more. July. 2 more months of being subjected to the same hellish conditions. Sighing, Avery stepped onto the sidewalk of her condo complex and beneath one of several olive trees shading the route to her place. A car door slammed. She glanced over her shoulder and her hand tightened on the strap of her purse. Even though the parking lot and common areas were in full daylight, Avery couldn't relax. Last week, someone had murdered a woman less than 5 miles away. Other than stating the victim had been stabbed multiple times, the press had leaked few details. The news initially reported her boyfriend as the prime suspect, but since he hadn't yet been arrested, there was a chance the sick psycho was out there. She grunted. Just another to add to the many crazies wandering the Phoenix area. Grabbing her mail key, she moved into the alcove of the communal mailboxes and stiffened. Luys, her neighbor, stood rummaging inside his box. She didn't know anything about him other than his name. She shouldn't even want to. She started to take a step backward, but then he turned and she forced herself forward. She wasn't about to let him think she was avoiding him. Straightening her shoulders, she stepped over to her mailbox and 3 feet from his own. His aftershave drifted toward her, a supple scent of cedar or pine with maybe a hint of orange. Avery tightened her jaw. So he smelled nice. Lots of men smelled nice. So what if he was over 6 feet and looked gorgeous in his tailored slacks, white button-down shirt cuffed at the elbows that contrasted with this dark brown, almost black hair? Lots of men in Scottsdale were drool-worthy. She'd even dated a couple. Granted, they hadn't exactly been keepers. This guy didn't know how to do anything but frown. Not once had she seen him crack a smile. She liked friendly. She liked people who smiled. She liked someone who didn't frown all the time. Life was too short. After unlocking her metal cubicle, she found a couple of flyers inside. Most of her bills came via email, but she checked once a week in case she might have missed something important. Excuse me. She blinked. With her hand inside her mailbox, she turned to her neighbor, forcing a bland expression on her face. Then she realized he was, of course, frowning at her, expecting some type of response. What? You're stepping on a letter of mine. She glanced down and recognized he was right. It must have slipped from his mailbox and landed on the ground. She stepped off the letter, or tried to. Great. The envelope was attached to the sole of her shoe. A distinct and impatient sigh passed his lips. She shook her foot a couple of times, but the blasted thing stuck. She rested a hand against the wall, but he beat her to the envelope. He caught her ankle. Here, let me. The cool pressure of his hand on her skin shot a tremor of shock up her leg. Before she had the thought to respond, he deftly peeled the envelope from her sole and released her ankle. She had a brief glimpse of her footprint and gum on the once pristine white paper before he stuffed it between his junk mail. It was her turn to frown. She stepped backward, widening the space between them. That's when she noticed something by his feet. What is that? I can't tell. There's so much fur. A kitten. He scooped up the animal with one hand. I didn't know you had a cat. She avoided meeting his gaze to stare at the tortoiseshell kitten. The last time they'd had eye contact was when he'd gotten a full frontal view of her partially naked body coming out of the community pool. She hadn't intended to flash him. She'd thought her swimming top was on. He'd acted as if she'd intentionally given him an eyeful. Well, it seems I've inherited one today. He turned his back and walked toward his condo. She crinkled her mail beneath a fist, waited a minute, and moved from the mailbox to her condo. As she rounded the corner to her home, the neighbor disappeared into his place next to hers before closing the door behind him. Once inside, she quickly stripped and showered, washing away the day's stresses from her auburn hair and body. She was meeting Christina and her husband, also relatively new neighbors, who lived 2 buildings away in the complex. She loved this area in Scottsdale, Arizona. A bit of old town, but still safe compared to other parts of Phoenix. The last 2 weekends, she joined her neighbors for drinks. She usually always met them instead of going together. That way, she could leave when she wanted or needed to. She wasn't one to stay out past midnight, and they seemed to like the nightlife, at least going to another bar and not getting home until after 3 a.m. After changing into a long, flowing white sleeveless dress, anything more and she'd be sweating the second she was outside, she walked the short distance in a pair of flats to The Thing, a restaurant and lounge that opened last month and was considered the place. Give it a month, though, and the next rage will replace it. She reached the entrance of the restaurant, then maneuvered through the crowd to get to the hostess. Her phone dinged with a text. Christina. Perfect timing. We're in the back right corner. I'm wearing bright pink. You can't miss me. Avery broke free from the lobby to get to the bar, feeling like a pinball as she bumped shoulders and bodies to get through the crowd. So, how goes it? Christina greeted her with a grin. Great, it's the weekend, and a drink sounds pretty good about now. She dropped into the plush lounge chair opposite Christina and her husband. Hey, Stephen. Slouched in an overstuffed chair, Christina's husband straightened, leaned forward, and set his drink on the low-slung copper coffee table. Dark brown hair, thick and wavy, reached past his shoulders, while his equally dark brown eyes, prominent jaw, and brow added to the handsome, sexy picture. He was just as attractive as her neighbor, but unlike her neighbor, Stephen knew how to smile. Glad to see you made it. He flashed a set of perfect white teeth. Christina was telling me your new job has been challenging. Avery shrugged. Yeah, but it's not something I wasn't expecting. If it involves too much mental or physical effort, I'm gone. He tapped a finger on the arm of his chair and shook his head before he waved down a waiter. Once he took their drink and appetizer order, Stephen urged, So, tell me about your new position. Not sure I could do what you do. Sounds like work. That's why they call it a job. Funny, Christina laughed before throwing an odd look at Stephen. I promised myself I wouldn't complain. Compared to my last job, they offer far better insurance, which kicks in next month. Then Avery admitted, but it's going to be challenging. I won't lie. I'm just going to have to learn to compartmentalize better than I ever have being a social worker. I can't let my clients' lives emotionally cripple me. Otherwise, I won't be a help to anyone. Christina wrinkled her nose. I'd be too depressed working with the mentally and physically challenged, especially when you can only do so much with your job. I can't imagine living on the street, and I surely couldn't handle knowing a mother and her autistic child were living in their car. Hey, I thought we came out to have fun, not talk about something maudlin and depressing. Stephen arched a brow at his wife. Wasn't that the purpose? Yes, of course, Christina agreed as the waiter came with their drinks and food. Good. Stephen took a deep swallow of his whiskey and club soda. Ice cubes rattled when he planted his glass on the coffee table and eyed Christina. With the fingers of one hand, Christina gripped her fingers around her wrist, and circled them back and forth as she stared at her lap and didn't touch her food. It's good to get out. Being behind a desk all day with ledgers and numbers can get a little mind-numbing even when I enjoy accounting. Avery frowned and shifted in her seat. Christina's mood had just done a nosedive, but why? Had Avery missed something? Stephen didn't look upset, but there was a definite tension around the coffee table, unless Avery's mood detector was out of whack. Christina tugged the strap of her purse from her arm of her chair, strung it over her shoulder, and rose. I'll be back in a bit. The restroom calls. Not a good sign when I haven't even had a drink yet. Stephen caught his wife's wrist and teased. Do you have to? I'll miss you. I'll miss you too. Do I get a kiss at least? Stephen asked with a half grin. Of course. Christina quickly leaned down and kissed him. As she turned, the curtain of her dark chocolate-colored hair obscured her expression. I might as well join you. Avery swiftly rose and followed her friend to the restroom. In the bathroom, Avery blinked at the harsh fluorescent bulbs, a drastic shift from the muted lighting in the main bar and dining area. Once done in the bathroom stall, she joined Christina at the sinks and washed her hands. When Christina lifted a hand to brush her hair away from her brow, her long sleeve slid backward to expose several black and purple bruises. What happened? Christina dropped her hand and brushed her sleeve back down. Nothing. I fell. Going down, I hit my arm on the counter. It looks awful. Avery stepped closer and lifted the hem. Her friend sidestepped, but not before Avery caught sight of 4 distinct marks similar to a hand's brutal grasp. She opened her mouth to argue, but closed it at the belligerent gleam in Christina's eyes. "Let's go," Christina murmured, then slipped from the bathroom, not waiting to see if Avery followed. The wontons, edamame, and sliders were tasty and still warm when they returned to their chairs. For the next hour, Avery struggled to keep her expression neutral, but she couldn't stop thinking of Christina's bruises. Stephen must have grabbed Christina hard enough to leave marks. It must have hurt like hell. Avery didn't have any proof it was her husband, but who else would it be? The abuser was always the spouse, right? Christina wasn't having an affair. At least Christina never mentioned it. And those were finger marks, not some light bruising from hitting the corner of a counter. Avery wasn't that naive. She'd seen too much abuse over the years. When Christina sank into the chair next to her husband, Stephen grabbed her hand and brought her fingers to his lips in a brief caress. Her fingers curled into his before she slipped them from his grasp, too quickly, it seemed like, and reached for her drink on the coffee table. Avery briefly made eye contact with Stephen, unable to read beyond his planned expression, but something in his eyes made her take a deep swallow of her drink. The smooth and smoky texture of her wine didn't soothe her growing agitation. Her hand tightened on the glass. She shifted uneasily in her chair. Avery stared down at her half-empty drink. She hated the idea that Christina might be in an abusive relationship. Ugh. She could offer help and direct her to various available resources, but she couldn't force her friend into doing anything. The evening had lost any pleasure she might have found in it. She glanced at her phone by her elbow on the armrest of her chair, a little after 9. She placed a hand against a pretend yawn. I think I'm going to head on home. It's been a crazy busy week." "How about we drive you home?" Christina asked. "We can drop you off on our way to the Dirty Buffalo." No, I'll be fine." "What about a taxi or Uber?" Avery arched a brow. "To drive me 2 blocks?" Christina shrugged and made a face. "Well, you never know. You heard what happened in North Scottsdale, right?" "Yeah, I should be safe. They're saying it's the boyfriend and not a serial killer." "The suspect's always the boyfriend." Stephen reached for Christina's hand again and chuckled. "Well, I guess it's a good thing I'm your very boring husband and not your boyfriend." Christina groaned with a laugh, but Avery found nothing funny about the topic. Then her friend frowned. "I hear the scene was pretty gruesome." "When it gets personal, it usually is," Avery said. Christina made a face. "Well, I hate to say this, but I hope it really is the boyfriend. I don't think I can handle another serial killer in the Phoenix area. The last one had everyone driving on the freeways terrified." Stephen let go of Christina's hand and leaned toward the table. "I guess the serial shooter didn't think of his victims as people." "That's crazy." Christina wrinkled her nose. I don't know who gets off by killing some random person. From what I've heard, the serial shooter thought it was some type of game. I'll never get it." Christina shook her head, her lip curling. "Using people as target practice? How long can you get?" "They're sick," Avery set her glass on the table. "Or evil," Stephen argued. Avery cocked her head to one side. "You think there's such a thing as evil? What about a person being mentally ill?" Stephen shook his head. "There are too many people who are mentally ill." He waved a hand around the room. "Take this place. I'm sure if we counted everyone here, I'd run out of fingers. Lots of people have mental health issues. You don't see them shooting down people on the freeway." "True." Avery shifted in her chair. "But there are degrees of mental illness. Many people can function easily in society and mask their pain and psychosis. Most people don't like their illness to become common gossip. Even now, with public figures coming out with their depression or other disorder, I think it's still a big taboo. Society is still too apathetic with stereotypes." She didn't know how the conversation had turned this dark and morbid. "Interesting point." Stephen leaned further toward the table between them and rested both elbows on his knees. "If you say there's a large percentage of mental illness in the general population, and evil has nothing to do with it, then the country would be inundated with shootings, stabbings, and continuous violence because of some mental incapacity. The police wouldn't be able to get a handle on it. Society would turn into pure chaos." Stephen's mouth turned into a thin line. "No, I'm not buying that. There's evil. It's called choice. A person chooses that fork in the road. They justify their behavior, they pursue self-gratification, and to hell with the ramifications and the ruin they leave behind. And if it becomes personal, it gets even messier. Okay, this has gotten way out of control. Christina broke into the conversation, waving a hand as if in surrender. She laughed, but the inflection sounded hollow. I'm not going to argue, Avery said, shaking her head. And before the evening gets even more depressing, I think it's about time I took myself home. I hope I didn't completely ruin your evening. She smiled at Christina. Right now, she didn't care if she dampened Stephen's night. He'd been way too argumentative and sanctimonious. Are you sure you're not too tired to hang out longer? Stephen's younger brother is visiting, and we don't want to go home just yet. He can be a bit much at times. Christina's eyes crinkled with a smile. You can join us if you want to at the Dirty Buffalo. We're going to head out there in an hour. You know you're always welcome. Right, Stephen? Of course. His lips curved into a genuine smile. Avery paused with a reply, but already knew her answer. Until tonight, she'd considered Stephen fun to be with, but now she wasn't so sure. Not with Christina's bruises. Yeah, she might judge him with no proof, but she couldn't shake her feelings. Right now, she found Stephen unnerving. Talking about evil sure hadn't helped. She shook her head, grabbing her phone to slip inside her purse. Thanks for the offer. Home is sounding pretty good after the day I've had. A walk and some fresh air will do me some good. Plus, it's just 2 blocks away. When she pulled her wallet from her purse, Stephen lifted a hand. Hey, I've got it. Are you sure? Of course, Stephen smiled, humor dancing in his dark eyes. The softening in his face made Avery wonder if she was getting way too reactive and spinning tales where there were none. The couple could be into rough sex. She nodded and smiled back. Thanks. She slipped from their table with a wave. Once outside, the quiet of the night shouted at her, making her realize how loud the bar had been. The abrupt silence made her suddenly aware of her solitude, so she was alone. Millions of people were alone, but they had other people in their life, family, friends. She didn't have family, but she did have a few friends, but no one close to her. Another voice argued inside her head. Because you've let no one get that close. Because you're chicken. A scaredy cat. She mentally shook her head. She wasn't scared. The opportunity just hadn't been there yet. That was all. Yeah, right. Several cars sped past as she walked down the sidewalk. She felt pretty safe. The street had a good amount of traffic, and there weren't really any areas without lighting other than a couple of large Palo Verde trees throwing shadows in places. The heat, though, hadn't abated. After walking 50 feet from the thing, she felt sweat cling to the small of her back beneath her breasts and hairline. She'd be drenched by the time she got to her front door. When her one-story condo came into view, she pulled out her key ring and quickened her step. The light by her front door beckoned. The neighbor's windows were black. Maybe he'd gone to bed already. Probably alone. She hadn't yet seen him with a woman or a man. Avery frowned. She shouldn't be thinking about what he was doing or with who. A scrape of a foot against asphalt broke into the night behind her. She looked over her shoulder. Nothing other than the trees rustling in the wind. No sign of another person behind, to the sides, or in front of her. The lights in the parking lot illuminated all the cars except for the ones beneath the overhang along the brick fence. Shivering, she left the sidewalk and cut across the decomposed granite toward her condo, slipping a hand into her purse for the pepper spray tucked away in a side pocket. A flash of movement entered her peripheral vision. She pulled her hand from her purse, her finger on the nozzle. Laughter. A voice, the words indistinguishable and unidentifiable as male or female. Pain, savage in intensity, crashed against her skull. Then she fell into blackness.